The more Mr. Bingley saw of Jane, the more he seemed to like her. As for Jane, Elizabeth could tell that her sister was falling in love. But Elizabeth was pleased to see that Jane refused to show her feelings. That would keep her safe from the suspicions and teasing of others. Elizabeth mentioned this to Charlotte Lucas. "It's not always good to be so guarded," Charlotte said. "If a woman hides her affection, she may lose the man she likes. Jane does help him on, as much as her nature will allow," Elizabeth explained. "But whenever she sees him, it's in a large party. She really doesn't know his character well." "Of course," Charlotte said, "I wish Jane success with all my heart. But happiness in marriage is a matter of chance. I believe it is better to know as little as possible about the faults of the person you marry." Elizabeth smiled. "You make me laugh, Charlotte. You'd never act that way yourself." Whenever Bingley was with her sister, Elizabeth watched closely. Meanwhile, there was one thing she failed to notice: Mr. Darcy was becoming interested in her. Sir William Lucas remarked to Mr. Darcy, "There's nothing like dancing. I believe it's one of the true signs of fine society." "Dancing is also popular in less fine societies," Darcy said. "Every savage can dance." Just then, Elizabeth was moving in their direction. "Mr. Darcy," Sir William said, "you must allow me to present this young lady to you. She's a perfect dancing partner." Sir William took Elizabeth's hand and was about to offer it to Mr. Darcy. But she instantly drew back. "Indeed, sir," she said quickly, "I don't have the least intention of dancing." When Mr. Darcy asked her if she would dance, Elizabeth politely refused and turned away. They didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. But Mr. Darcy was to see Elizabeth again soon, in an unexpected manner. One morning, Jane was invited by Bingley's sisters, Caroline and Louisa, to dine with them that evening. Jane asked her mother for the carriage. "No, my dear," her mother answered. "You had better go on horseback. It looks like it will rain, and then you can stay all night." In fact, it rained hard that day. Jane was completely wet by the time she arrived. She spent the night at Netherfield Hall and was very ill when she woke up. Hearing this, Mr. Bennet teased his wife. "Well, my dear," he said, "if your daughter should die, at least it will be for a good cause." "Oh, people do not die of little colds," Mrs. Bennet said in an irritated voice. Elizabeth was worried, however. The family carriage was not available, and she was not a horsewoman. But she was determined to see her sister, so she decided to walk. "We'll go as far as Meryton with you," Catherine and Lydia volunteered. Elizabeth knew that a militia regiment had recently arrived in the nearby town of Meryton. It happened that their aunt and uncle, the Phillipses, lived there. Lately, Catherine and Lydia had talked of nothing but officers. At Meryton, Elizabeth said goodbye to her sisters and went on alone. She arrived at Netherfield Hall with muddy stockings. Her face was glowing with the warmth of exercise. Poor Jane was indeed ill with fever and headache. When Elizabeth was also invited to stay, she accepted gratefully. A servant was sent to tell the Bennet family of her plans, and to bring back a supply of clothes. At 6:30, Elizabeth was called to dinner. Everyone asked about Jane's health. Young Bingley seemed truly worried about Jane. Elizabeth warmed to his kindness. When dinner was over, Elizabeth returned to Jane's side. As soon as she was out of the room, Mrs. Hurst said, "I shall never forget Miss Elizabeth Bennet's appearance this morning. She looked almost wild." Caroline agreed. "Why should she even come here? Why go scampering about the country just because her sister has a cold? And looking so untidy, too." "Your image may be correct," Bingley said, "but this was all lost on me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked wonderfully well this morning. To me, coming here shows a deep affection for her sister." "I think very highly of Jane Bennet," Mrs. Hurst said. "She's really a very sweet girl. I wish with all my heart that she was well married. But with such a family, and such low connections, I'm afraid there's no chance of it." "I've heard that their uncle, Mr. Phillips, is a lawyer in Meryton," Caroline said. Mrs. Hurst snickered. "Yes, and I believe they have another, somewhere in London, near Cheapside." Both sisters laughed. Bingley looked annoyed. "If they had uncles enough to fill all of Cheapside, it would make no difference to me." Darcy said, "But surely you must agree, Bingley, that it hurts their chances of marrying well." To this Bingley made no answer. The next morning, Mrs. Bennet, along with Catherine and Lydia, came to visit Jane. Mrs. Bennet's behavior embarrassed Elizabeth completely. First, she boasted about Jane's beauty and good nature. Then she insulted Mr. Darcy. She compared him to Sir William Lucas, whom she said was far friendlier. After seeing Jane, Mrs. Bennet announced that her daughter was too ill to be moved. She was happy to have Jane stay. Elizabeth groaned. She was eager to have her sister well, and even more eager to leave.